We are back with another episode of Mission Control, the Bellwether Enterprise Podcast. We continue the podcast in Dallas, Texas, where much like a previous episode, which can be found on our Bellwether Enterprise YouTube channel and on all major podcast platforms, I sat down with Kevin Bowen, who brought a client of his onto the show. Joining us for this episode was Jeff Spicer, who is a partner at Dominium, which is the largest affordable developer in the country. We talk about how preservation can be a key to sustaining affordable housing going forward and overall ways to keep up on the supply side of things with the likely rise in demand for affordable housing with a potential economic recession on the horizon. So from Jeff's beautiful Dallas home, here is that conversation with Kevin Bowen and Jeff Spicer. Launching into it, I would like to kind of get from your perspective just a little bit about your background and, what you've got going on with your career and business here today. So you can jump right into that.
Great. So I'm Jeff Spicer. I'm a partner at Dominium. Dominium is a company founded in 1972, and we're probably the largest affordable developer in the nation. We have approximately 35,000 units on the ground right now, and those are a combination of new construction and acquisition and rehab and workout deals. So that's kind of a little background on Dominium. I've been a partner there 2 years. Prior to that, I had my own company, State Street Housing, with a partner. For a number of reasons, we split up, and it made sense. Dominium has a great platform, so went there. And before that, I'd done a number of work for several other larger developers, including Philly Properties and Southwest Housing in Texas. So all total, I've been involved in development of probably something around 15,000 units of affordable housing.
Yeah, and Kevin, if you want to kind of talk about your guys' relationship and how you got, how you met each other. You mentioned to me that you look at Jeff as, a mentor. Just kind of how you guys got connected and all that.
Yeah, it's Jeff and I have known each other for a number of years. He actually was a consultant for a lot of my clients. Worked with them in putting together tax credit applications and getting them through the process. And Jeff and I met actually because he was a consultant for a lot of my clients on a lot of the forward transactions that I was working on. And our friendship grew and got to the point a couple of years ago, it was like, we need to start doing business together. And so we started doing business together. And the rest is kind of history. A couple years ago, he came to me with a problem, said, Kevin, there's a sort of a gap here and a certain type of financing that he was looking for and that needed. And I said, well, Jeff, I think I can put that together for you. And here we are a couple years later. And sure enough, we put it together. We put a program together and
done several transactions, look to do several more.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Jeff, what do you see going on in the marketplace right now? I hear you at Dominium, you're doing a lot of acquisition work right now. Kind of what's the status, do you think, of the affordable space, in Texas and also, larger in the region as well?
Sure. So Texas has an awful lot of year 15 properties coming up. When you look at what happened 15 years ago, we call that the go-go days of the bonds in Texas. And there were a huge number of properties that use tax-exempt bonds for financing, and that is coming to its crescendo here over the next 3 to 5 years of properties available for that type of acquisition. So we're looking to acquire a percentage of those, but we're getting more and more competition in that space from non-developers, larger equity funds. Larger REITs are looking at that space as well, as they're in a search for yield out there, as the yields in the top markets have been shrinking. They're looking for yield in other markets, and one of those markets happens to be affordable housing. So we're facing increasing competition to keep the properties affordable, and that's one of the things that we're seeing in Texas. So the competition has certainly increased here for properties to acquire.
How does that competition kind of work out, or what's kind of the outlook for, bridging the gap between needing more units and actually getting more units in place for people to move into?
Part of that is that, we look at more units adding to the additional stock as new construction. And so there is always, there will be a fight at some point in time between new construction and acquisition and preservation. Really, preservation is the most effective way to keep the units on the ground. is to preserve them, because for every dollar in new construction you spend, you can preserve a unit for 25 cents. So when you look at that, it's far more effective and efficient to preserve units than let them go out of the program. So from our perspective, we want to preserve as many units as possible. And we see that done by other companies like ourselves that are really focused on preservation in the long run, not necessarily the private equity markets that are looking for the maximum return on their dollar, and that's not necessarily keeping the properties affordable. So from our perspective, I think we want to make sure one, we preserve what we have, use our financing most effectively, and two, build new product to make sure that we're actually increasing the stock of affordable housing in the long run.
And Kevin, you might want to jump in on this next question as well from your perspective. But Jeff, with the current state of the economy and the rates that are, at the rates that they are and these low amounts and everything, how is that impacting the affordable space overall in the region and maybe even nationwide as things are shaping up right now, I guess?
Lower rates are certainly helping on the new construction side to make more deals feasible. So that is one effect, but we want to. I think we're going to see a lot of refinancing right now as well on the properties that can refinance to lock in long-term rates and make sure those rates can be as affordable as possible for the long term and preserving the affordable housing.
Yeah, and just because the rates are low right now, it's an interesting situation because rates are low. They're the lowest they've been, but the ability to do really high leverage and really aggressive debt right now is getting harder and harder to do. And really, in about the last month, we've seen a big change in that. So longer amounts of interest only, cash outs on refinances are becoming more difficult. And with that, though, I think we're going to see cap rates start to get a little more conservative. And the market for properties that are for sale, it's going to slow down a little bit because buyers can't finance as much as they used to be able to. And Jeff mentioned chasing yield. It's a lot easier to chase yield when you can get longer term interest only, especially on acquisitions. That's harder to get right now. So I think we're going to see property prices start to come down a little bit. There's going to be a bit of a market adjustment. There's a lot of talk we're going to see a recession here in the relatively near future, and that will sort of bring prices down a little more, but will increase the need for affordable housing. So
yeah, certainly. And so from that perspective, we've seen long-term rates drop by in half from over 320 basis points down to 160 as of today, I believe, or it's 170 today. So that has a large effect on what you're able to finance, but at the same time, it does have a yield effect, and has we've seen slight tightening the marketing, especially on the underwriting side.
Sure. And going off of what you mentioned about, a looming recession that you hear a lot about, what do you think that could have, what impact do you think that could have on the affordable space if, what is often being predicted actually comes to fruition in the next several years?
On the affordable side, it really drives demand. And you get to a recession and you assume that means lower incomes and greater joblessness out there. So that unemployment will, allow or cause a greater need for affordable housing. So from that perspective, we think the demand will increase and it will outstrip supply. So we already have a supply demand in equilibrium, and that'll only get worse with the recession.
Go ahead.
We do have to. I agree with everything Jeff said. The one thing we have to, as a lender, and I know Jeff as a developer and owner is really looking at closely, is with the looming threat of the recession, incomes will theoretically drop, which we've been able to underwrite increases in rents for the last couple of years because of the strong market. We won't be able to underwrite those increased rents to the same extent that we have historically. So that is one thing that, as a lender, and I know as a developer, Jeff, you have to look a little bit longer term and maybe get a little more conservative on your rent growth projections when looking at new deals. But overall, the need is just going to increase.
Yeah. So how do you respond to the need for more of a supply? Like what kind of, and maybe what are you kind of setting up now if there is anything that you're doing now that is kind of preparing for what may come? And
yeah, we're really not doing anything to prepare on the supply side. We're looking at our own portfolio and kind of stress testing that, looking at the markets we're in and saying, in the markets that we're in today, what is our rent advantage to market, and should a recession hit, what does that look like to us as far as the rent advantage in that market? That's important for us. One of the reasons that we are in the affordable business is that we see that there's a rent advantage. We can lower rents from the market to where we are by several $100s, and that disappears as a recession hits and makes renting the apartments that we do own today that much more difficult. So from the ownership's perspective, that's what we're looking at. In a new construction perspective, we're looking at that same issue, and we want to be several $100s per unit a month under the market rates for the similar type of unit.
And like bigger picture, community wise, is there things that you're looking at? I mean, is it based on like policy things that may need to be put in place or changes that need to happen to kind of make sure that people have places to live if, things economy wise go south? And I guess there's no problem yet, but perhaps there may be with that lack of supply. What do you think could be?
Yeah, lack of supply from a policy perspective. On the bond side, we'd like to see the 4%, fixed rate for the tax credits on the bonds as opposed to a floating rate. That'll increase supply substantially and what we're able to fund and construct. And really, it's really about getting more units out there. To us, that's the biggest issue. Even in a recession, we need more units.
Good. Yeah, and we talked earlier in another episode just about the lack of space, more or less, in the Dallas area at least. Is it an option to kind of repurpose a lot of properties and convert some spaces that right now are not affordable into affordable? Is that kind of an option, do you think, or how do you?
There are some. I mean, and Dominium historically has done a lot of historic rehabs in that space and adaptive reuse. The options in Dallas right now, I think, are limited simply because we have a very vibrant office retail market here as well. And so repurposing things that are being used at their highest and best use is really not the way to go. So we don't see that as a huge opportunity here. Dallas needs a more progressive housing policy in general. I've worked on the Dallas Housing Task Force for the city to see if we can, update their policies, help them get a more progressive policy and get more affordable housing in Dallas.
Sure. And another thing I wanted to touch on is, we hear a lot from our own employees and executives about the culture and what it's like to, work with Bellwether. From your perspective, though, as a client, what is kind of your take on what Bellwether has to offer and what you get from working with Bellwether, I guess?
Sure. Part of what we look for in any lender, and we certainly see this in Bellwether, is we look for certainty of close. That you're going to do exactly what you tell us you're going to do and follow through on that. And I think Bellwether has a culture of providing exactly that. Second, they also have a creative culture, since they are not a financial institution, so to speak, that's regulated, that they have the ability to be more creative and use other levers, so to speak, in the market to provide the financing that's needed and find creative solutions to some of the housing financing problems that we have today.
And I kind of like to keep it light a little bit. I hear you're a big music fan. Has there been any concerts or anything you've attended recently or coming up? Or
what is the most recent concert, or what's next on your schedule?
Yeah. The Who. So
The Who. Oh, wow. Where is that?
That's going to be here in Dallas. So
very cool.
Seeing The Who here in Dallas with the kids, make sure my kids understand what real music is about.
Right. Have you seen them a lot of times in the past?
I've only seen them once before.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, it's a great show.
Right on. Well, thanks again for sitting down with me. Had pleasure having this conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.